Welcome everyone. Today we are looking at one of the capabilities that were added to Terraform test framework as of version 1.7. Tests were added to Terraform as an experimental feature towards 1.5 version and then made GA in 1.6. It allowed you to create unit or integration test using run blocks within the HCL configuration. Terraform test would look for a folder called test or a user specified folder where you had the test. The test would be either in .tf_test.hcl or .tf_test.json format. As it states, it could have one or more run blocks, variables, provider blocks, which helps you specify what those details are when you run those tests. Now let's take a look at an example like that and see why the mock provider or the mock resources and the mock provider helps us to do these testing better. Now I have my configuration in the main.tf. All it does is create an S3 bucket using the variable called bucket name. Since this is an AWS S3 bucket, it has some restrictions with the way the name has been provided. There are some constraints on the way it has to be. Since it can be a fully qualified domain name, you have to have some conditions which it matches or adheres to. Some of the common ones would be the length of the bucket name string or the character, and not having adjacent periods and things of the nature. The resources list like that, AWS S3 bucket with the input of bucket. Let's go to the folder called test, which I'm specifying as a default folder for my test, and it's got main.tf_test.hcl. Since I've defined a variable that needs to be provided for the configuration to work, I'm using the variables block in the .hcl file to provide the only variable that I'm asking the user to provide. I'm defining a variable value called test bucket. I'm trying to run a validate plan, which is basically my test in this case to reference what needs to be validated. The command is literally the command that you're asking Terraform to perform. It's either plan or apply. If you don't specify the value, it defaults to an apply. If you're familiar with the AWS S3 bucket configuration, the reference, if you create a resource, if you plan a resource, the value that is provided to that as an input is something which you can query. In this case, I'm looking for AWS S3 bucket.this.bucket, which is basically the value that I provide as an input. So let's verify or see if we can validate this. Again, the assertion block within run follows similar condition and error message structure, which you're familiar with from the variable validation, check blocks, and precondition life cycles. Let's see if this runs. So if I'm running Terraform test, first of all, I'm asking it to run a plan. Obviously, it requires a configuration to pull down the provider that it's interacting with. So till then, the Terraform configuration or the test configuration even doesn't understand what it's working with. Let's comply and do a Terraform init. As it pulls down the configuration, you can see it's using my initial configuration since it's from the root structure. It's using the versions.tf that I specified, 5.4 version of AWS provider, and it creates the log file and the .terraform folder as expected. So Terraform has been successfully initialized. Let's clear the screen. Let's do a Terraform test here. Terraform is being asked to run a plan and validate the output. What do you think it'll happen? No valid credential sources found. Okay. So what's happening here is Terraform is trying to create a plan and validate the structure of that particular plan with my assertion. Now with any Terraform plan, in this case with AWS provider, it is looking for some credentials so that Terraform can look for a value that's available or refresh or the normal Terraform plan process. So in this case, it's trying to find any credential that is associated with your provider, in this case AWS. This is where a mock provider comes in handy. A mock provider is just what it says it is. it helps you to mock a provider that you're interacting with so that you can provide some defaults to the outputs that you'd expect that provider to result in. Let's say a mock provider, AWS. I'm going to try to run this, but I've not. So one thing I've missed in here is I've not specified the, provider that this run block is going to use. Till you specify what provider you are using for your run block, it's going to default to the original AWS provider. Let's change that. It can be done using this providers block. And what it takes is an argument of which matches the provider that you're interacting with, which is AWS. The resource that you have in this case is AWS itself. Now one thing I could do in here is provide an alias which says this is a mock provider. Now all I'm saying here is for the provider called AWS, instead of using the regular provider configuration that is pulled down, use a mock provider. I've not specified any details, outputs, or things of the nature. All I'm asking is to use that mock provider rather than the credential based one. Let's see if the run complies. I'm doing Terraform test and it applies and works. Why? Because Terraform is using that mock provider instead of the reference that we had with respect to the actual AWS provider. Now for a plan, a mock provider may not be much of a help. Again, it can help in case of your CI servers where you're running a test and you want to validate your plans. But I think the real power comes in when you want to apply some verifications, or validate some verifications, or validate some tests against your apply stages, or things you want to validate in case of situation where you want to have it run against something and provide some values, and you want to know that it's actually interacting with the right provider, right references, and things of the nature. I'm going to copy some code that I had, so I don't have to type the whole thing in, and walk you through it. So I had this, if I comment this out, this block should be familiar with the previous conversation. I had a mock provider, AWS, with an alias mock AWS. I had some variables referenced in there. I've removed it because you can either provide variables using .tf wash file or within the run block itself. So I've specified it under the run block. Let's run this without the mock resource. It's actually failing on one of them and passing a lot of other tests. Let's see what those tests are before you try to fix it. Now the first test is to verify that the AWS bucket returns an ID, which in case of AWS S3 bucket resource is basically the bucket name. So most of the AWS resources as part of the provider gives you an ID or an ARN or some other value as an output. In the attribute configuration of the provider documentation and the resource, you'll be able to find that. Now the interesting thing here is that it's returning some value which is sort of not matching the value that I expected. Primary reason being, the Terraform documentation regarding tests also specifies it. ID is something which Terraform just randomly generates. It doesn't have any understanding of what that provider expects it to be. So if you want to specify that value be some constraint or some value, some specific, it has to conform to some specific value, you have to provide that in the mock provider itself. That's where a mock resource comes in. The mock resource in this case is saying, hey, I'm going to, along with referencing a mock provider, I'm going to use a mock resource, which is going to match the type of the resource that you're interacting with. In this case, it's AWS S3 bucket. And I'm going to define some defaults. In this case, I'm only defining the ID and the ARN. The ID being the name of the bucket, which is a test bucket, sort of matches with the variable name I've provided. ARN, which in this case is the S3 ARN. Though I'm not validating, I'm just providing the value. Let's see if that makes any changes. Now, Terraform is actually using that. And instead of using the default ID that is generated by Terraform test framework, using my specific ID that I gave, which is test bucket, which is the bucket name. Now let's take a look at the other validation that I have, which is passing. And I've named it on the basis of the validations that I have. In this case, validate variable validations for hyphen, length, starting character, periods, IP, things of that nature. Let's see what those are. Now the structure of all of these looks similar, except for the condition. The condition in here is expect failures than an assert. So again, we're talking just about the mock provider, but I want to introduce you to something called as exception, something which helps you to validate exceptions. On top of the variable validations you may have added, which applies or which runs when you run a plan, you want to make sure that such a specific input, for example, if I provide an input which is less than 3 characters, it should fail and tell me that, hey, bucket name must be between 3 and 63 characters long. A way to handle it is, if you've worked with something like PyTest or JUnit or any XUnit test framework, you have a way to validate that you're actually throwing an exception. So this expect failures is something similar. The expect failures is expecting for the bucket name variable to throw an exception or a failure when you provide an input which it doesn't match. Let's see if it actually does it for a lower value. Let me see TE and see if this passes. By the validation that I provided, it should. For example, it is set to 2 letters, 2 characters, and it so passes. Let me see if it actually set to test. See how it behaves. Runs it. Okay. The checkable object was expected to report an error, but it did not, because we passed an input which is valid. Okay, let me push it back to the original one. And so this is just one way to use a provider having not to require to provide the credential underneath. So in this case, I'm working with the AWS provider. I don't need to provide the access key, secret key, and the session token. If you're working with an assume role or some long-living credentials for you to test it. So you can mock your resource, mock your provider and mock your resource and the underlying defaults that you want. This is just a very simple example of working with an S3 bucket. As you deal with data sources, as you deal with files, there are other references which I hope to cover in a later video. Thank you. Thank you for watching and hope you found this useful.